Nali followed Taran and his family into the glowing restaurant in Zorolo, trying to ignore the way her heart beat too fast. The place felt like it belonged to people who never had to think twice about anything. She kept telling herself this dinner was important, that building a life with Taran meant learning to sit at tables like this. At first the conversation floated around her like soft laughter, until she realized none of it felt soft at all. Jokes about her old neighborhood in Mavari, smiles that carried a small sting, a comment about her work at the clinic that made her chest tighten. She tried to laugh along, but her voice felt thin. Then she asked the waiter about an ingredient, just a simple question, and one of Taran's sisters let out a bright laugh that cut sharper than it should have. Someone whispered that she didn't belong here. Taran stayed quiet, staring at his glass. That silence hurt more than anything else. When his mother leaned in and told Nali she was embarrassing them, the words hit so hard she could barely breathe. She stood and walked outside before her tears slipped free. She was ready to leave Zorolo that night, to go home to Mavari and forget this whole evening. But when she returned to pay the bill, the waiter stopped her. He spoke gently and told her meals were already covered for a year, a gift from the estate of Dr Soro Makeni, the mentor who once believed in her future more than anyone else. The whole table went quiet when they heard it. Nali felt something warm rise through her, steady and calm. She thanked the waiter, turned to Taran's family, and told them she was done for the night. Then she stepped out into the Zorolo lights feeling lighter than she had in months, knowing she'd build her life on her own terms. Nali told me later that it began so quietly she almost missed it. One moment she was sitting at the long table in the busy restaurant in Zorolo, trying to follow the fast chatter of Taran's mother and sisters, and the next she felt a strange shift in the air, like the first cool breeze before a storm. They were smiling, laughing, acting warm, but their words held a thin edge. A small joke about how people from Mavari always spoke with that little bend in their voice. A comment about how her work at the community clinic must be cute, but probably exhausting for someone not used to real pressure. They said it lightly, almost playfully, as if they expected her to laugh too. She did try. She lifted her lips and let out a soft laugh, but inside her stomach pulled tight. She kept glancing at Taran, hoping he would jump in and change the subject, maybe even tease them back for teasing her. Instead, he kept nodding politely, watching his family with the quiet approval of someone who believed this was all harmless. And because he didn't stop them, the comments grew bolder. One sister leaned closer and said she couldn't imagine living in a neighborhood where the power went out so often. Another asked if people in Mavari really slept in their yards in the hot season, then quickly said she was just being curious, though her eyes shone with something that felt far from curiosity. Nali felt her face warm, and she tried to take small breaths so no one would see how shaken she was. The waiter passed by, and Nali used that tiny moment to steady herself, touching the edge of the table like it was her anchor. But the jokes didn't stop. They shifted from her home to her clothing, then back to her job, then to the way she had asked a question earlier about a dish. Taran's mother gave a small laugh that didn't reach her eyes and said that women from Mavari were known for asking too many questions, and maybe Nali was just proving the stories true. Nali felt something sink inside her, something heavy she couldn't name. She looked down at her hands and saw they were resting too still, as if they didn't belong to her. She thought of the children she treated at the clinic, the mothers who trusted her, the old men who joked with her when she cleaned their wounds. She thought of her mother, who used to brush her hair in the mornings and tell her she could walk into any room and hold her ground. And here she was, shrinking in a place where she had hoped to belong. She tried to smile again, but this time her voice didn't follow. The table buzzed with laughter, but to Nali it sounded distant, like she was underwater. She knew these weren't jokes anymore. They were warnings dressed in sweetness, small cuts meant to remind her she wasn't one of them. And the part that stung most was not their words but the quiet from Taran, a silence so clear it felt like agreement. When she finally lifted her eyes again, she realized she had never felt more alone at a table full of people. Nali told me she didn't even think before asking the question. The waiter set the menus down with a soft smile, and she pointed to a dish she didn't recognize. It was something with a spice she had never heard of, so she asked what it tasted like. A simple question, the kind anyone might ask. But before the waiter could answer, Taryn's sister burst into laughter, loud enough that a few people at nearby tables turned to look. It wasn't friendly laughter. It had a sharp clap to it, like a door slamming shut. She said Nali was being difficult, that the kitchen staff didn't have time to explain every little thing to someone who wasn't used to real restaurants. Another voice, softer but far crueler, muttered that Nali didn't belong in places like this anyway. Nali felt the words wrap around her like cold water. She turned to Taryn without thinking, waiting for him to say something, anything. His eyes stayed fixed on his menu. He ran his finger down the list of dishes as if he hadn't heard a single thing, but she knew he had. His shoulders had tightened. His jaw had moved. He was choosing silence, and somehow that choice hurt more than the insult itself. The waiter kept his gentle smile, explaining the ingredient to her with patience, and for a moment she felt a tiny thread of comfort in that. But the table had already shifted. The air felt thinner. Every laugh sounded pointed. Every comment seemed to carry a hidden edge. She tried to breathe slowly, though her chest felt too tight. She reminded herself she had worked in busy clinics where people trusted her with their lives. She had handled nights full of crying babies, power cuts, and medicine shortages. But none of that strength seemed to follow her here. One of the sisters leaned back in her chair and said she hoped Nali wasn't planning to ask the waiter about every dish on the menu. Another added that it must be tiring for Taryn to guide someone through simple things. These were not big insults. They were small stones tossed one after another, each one landing in the same place. Nali felt her face warm. She rubbed her thumb against the edge of her napkin just to stay steady. She wanted to believe Taryn would speak up soon, that he was just waiting for the right moment. But when she glanced at him again, he kept pretending to study the menu, even though he'd already decided on his meal long before they arrived. The noise of the restaurant felt distant now. She could see families laughing, couples sharing plates, friends leaning close to talk. And here she sat at a table full of people who didn't want her there. She thought of her mother's voice telling her she deserved kindness, that she should never shrink for anyone. Yet in that moment she felt herself shrinking anyway. She swallowed hard and tried to stay calm, but the truth pressed against her ribs. The table hadn't just turned cold. It had turned into a place where she was expected to disappear quietly, and she could feel herself fighting not to. Nali told me she felt the whole room tilt when Taryn's mother leaned forward, her bracelets clinking softly, her smile tight in a way that warned something sharp was coming. The table had grown quiet after the last round of jokes, the kind that left Nali nodding while wishing she could melt into her chair. Then, in a voice smooth enough to fool a stranger, Taryn's mother said Nali was embarrassing the family. Not the evening, not herself, the family. She said it so calmly that for a second Nali wondered if she had misheard. Before she could gather her thoughts, Taryn's mother added that she should step away from the table until she could compose herself, as if Nali were a child who had thrown a tantrum instead of a woman who had asked one question about a spice. Nali felt the words hit like something physical, a quiet blow right beneath her ribs. She froze. Her breath caught somewhere high in her chest. The restaurant lights blurred for a moment, and she felt her throat tighten the way it does just before tears force their way out. She knew she couldn't let that happen, not here, not in front of people waiting for her to break. She pressed her palms against the fabric of her dress to stop the trembling. She tried to keep her face calm, the way her mother in Mavari had taught her during hard moments, when dignity mattered more than pride. She pushed her chair back slowly so the legs wouldn't scrape and call more attention to her. No one stopped her. One of the sisters looked down at her drink, pretending to be bored, though her smirk flickered for a second. Another tapped her nails on the table, as if counting the seconds until Nali walked away. Taryn stared at his hands. He didn't reach for her, not even when she brushed past him. She didn't need him to fight her battles, but she wanted him to at least see her, to meet her eyes and say something human, something that proved he understood how deep this cut went. Instead, he stayed still, quiet in that careful way he used whenever his mother spoke, as if his loyalty lived under her shadow instead of beside the woman he had asked to marry him. Nali's steps felt heavy as she moved through the restaurant, yet each one also held a strange clarity. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to get away before her voice cracked or her chest gave in. When she reached the entrance, she paused for just a second, breathing in the warm air drifting from the street. She didn't look back. She told me later that if she had, she might have seen her reflection in their eyes and believed the cruel story they were trying to write about her. But she didn't. She pushed the door open, stepped outside, and let the sounds of Zorolo wash over her like a reminder that the world was bigger than that table and kinder than the people sitting at it. Nali stepped out into the night air expecting it to calm her, but the moment it touched her skin it felt sharp, almost painful, like the world had turned too cold too fast. She leaned against the stone wall of the restaurant, keeping her eyes on the bright street of Zorolo where people walked past laughing, carrying shopping bags, calling out greetings, living their lives without knowing hers had just cracked a little. She tried to breathe slowly, but each breath caught in her throat. The humiliation settled first, heavy and hot. Then came the heartbreak, quieter but deeper, the kind that sinks instead of breaking. She kept seeing Taryn's mother's face, those steady eyes telling her to step away as if she were a problem to be removed. And behind that, the image that hurt even more. Taryn sitting still, choosing silence. Nali wiped the corners of her eyes, annoyed with herself. She whispered that she wasn't going to cry, that she was stronger than this. But the truth rose anyway, warm and unstoppable, slipping down her cheeks before she could stop it. She turned her face toward the street so no one coming out of the restaurant would see. She felt small for a moment, painfully small, like she was 16 again, standing outside her school in Mavari after some girls had made fun of her shoes. She remembered her mother telling her to hold her head high not because life was easy, but because dignity was something no one should be allowed to take. She took another breath and let it steady her. She wasn't angry yet. The anger would come later. Right now she felt only tired, the kind of tired that sits in your bones. She thought about going home, packing her things, leaving a quiet message for Taryn so he wouldn't worry. But then a clearer thought came, one that surprised her with its calmness. She would pay for her part of the meal and leave. Not storm out, not hide. Just settle her share and walk away with whatever pride she still had. It felt like the only thing she could control in that moment. She looked at the glowing restaurant sign, and for a second imagined herself walking back in, facing all those careful eyes, reaching for her small purse with a steady hand. It gave her a bit of strength. She pushed herself off the wall, wiped her face again, and told herself that crying did not make her weak. It made her human, and she had every right to feel hurt. The night around her hummed with life. A group of friends passed by, arguing over which street vendor sold the best roasted maize. A taxi honked at someone taking too long to cross the road. Somewhere down the block, a musician played a slow tune on a battered guitar. The world hadn't paused for her pain. Somehow that helped. She straightened her shoulders, took one more breath, and walked back toward the door, ready to finish what she needed to finish and leave all the rest behind. Nali walked back into the restaurant with slow steps, the noise washing over her in a soft blur. She kept her focus on the floor, on the patterned tiles she had barely noticed earlier. Her only plan was to walk to the counter, ask for her bill, and leave without giving anyone at the table a chance to look at her with pity or victory. But before she reached the counter, the waiter from earlier appeared beside her. His voice was gentle and respectful when he called her ma'am, and the word carried more care than anything she had heard all evening. She lifted her head, surprised by how steady his presence felt. She told him she wanted to pay for her part of the meal. He shook his head kindly and said her name was already on the bill. For a moment, she didn't understand. She wasn't sure if he meant someone at the table had tried to cover the cost for her as a way to smooth over the humiliation. She frowned and asked what he meant. The waiter lowered his voice as if sharing something sacred. He explained that earlier that day, the restaurant had received instructions from the estate of Dr. Soro Makeni, the man who had taught her during her internship at the small clinic in Katala, the same mentor who pushed her to apply for programs she didn't feel worthy of, the same man whose quiet belief in her had shaped half her courage. His estate had arranged for all her meals here to be covered for an entire year. Nali felt something inside her body halt, as if her heart had taken a sudden step forward, and the rest of her was slow to follow. She whispered his name without meaning to, and memories rushed in. His warm laugh echoing through the clinic halls, his steady hand on her shoulder after difficult days, his way of saying her future would not be tied to the limits other people imagined for her. She stood there frozen, not from fear this time, but from a shock so soft it almost felt like a blessing. The waiter watched her with understanding in his eyes. He told her Dr. Makeni had left specific notes, and one of them mentioned her by name, saying she deserved kindness wherever she went. Nali felt a warmth rise in her chest, slow and full, the kind of warmth that pushes back the cold without asking permission. She blinked quickly, trying not to cry again, but this time the tears felt different. They didn't sting. They didn't feel like defeat. They felt like every moment the world had held her quietly instead of breaking her. She straightened her back, not out of pride but out of gratitude. That simple act from her mentor's final wishes reached across time and lifted her in a way no one at that table could have imagined. For the first time that night, she felt seen, and not for her background or her mistakes or her quietness, but for the strength someone once knew she carried. The waiter asked Nali if she would like him to walk with her, and she nodded before she had time to think. His calm presence made the room feel less sharp, and as they moved toward the table, she felt every step settle her heartbeat. The restaurant lights softened around her, and the noise of clinking glasses faded into a gentle murmur. When they reached the table, Taryn's family looked up with the same polished expressions they had worn all evening, preparing themselves for whatever story they imagined she was bringing back. But the waiter spoke first. His voice carried across the table in a respectful, steady tone. He explained that the restaurant had been instructed to cover all of Nali's meals for a full year, a gesture made by Dr. Soro Makeni's estate to honor her work and her future. He said her name with care, almost like a title, and for a moment the whole table went still. The sisters stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. Their confident smirks faded into something quiet, something unsure. Taryn's mother blinked once, twice, trying to understand what she had just heard. Even the men at the neighboring table turned slightly, sensing the shift in the air. Taryn looked at Nali, and his face changed in a way she had not seen before. Shame flickered there, sharp and real, as if he had only now realized the weight of the silence he had given her earlier. Nali didn't speak. She didn't need to. The waiter finished his explanation, bowed his head slightly toward her, and stepped back with a dignity that spread into her own posture. For the first time that night she breathed without forcing herself to. The air felt clean, almost warm. She glanced at her hands and saw they were steady again. Something rose slowly in her chest, not triumph, not payback, but a calm certainty she hadn't felt in years. Dignity. It filled her to the edges, easing the tightness that had lived there since she first sat at the table. One of the sisters opened her mouth, maybe to apologize or explain away her behavior, but no words came. Taryn lowered his eyes, and in that small gesture, Nali understood that he finally saw what she had been carrying alone all evening. She didn't feel the need to forgive him or punish him. She felt something much cleaner, the freedom to choose herself. The night around them seemed to settle. The noise of the restaurant returned in gentle waves. She lifted her chin and took one slow breath that seemed to rewrite the whole story of the evening. The insults no longer clung to her. The shame that had followed her outside felt distant now, powerless. All she felt was the quiet strength of knowing her worth had never been in doubt, not to the person who believed in her first and not to the person she was still becoming. Nali thanked the waiter with a quiet warmth in her voice and placed a small tip in his hand, the kind of gesture that said more than words. She turned back to the table, and for a heartbeat the whole room seemed to listen. Taryn's family watched her with stiff faces, waiting for her to shrink again, but she didn't. She told them she wouldn't continue the evening, her voice steady and calm, almost gentle. There was no anger in it, no shaking, just a simple truth that landed softly and firmly at the same time. Taryn opened his mouth as if he wanted to speak, but whatever he hoped to say arrived too late to matter. She gave them all one final nod, not a goodbye, just an acknowledgement that this chapter had ended. She stepped out into the Zorolo night, and the air felt different now, warmer, as if the city itself was welcoming her back. Lights from passing taxis streaked across the street, and music drifted from a nearby bar, a deep, slow rhythm that made her heartbeat settle. She walked without hurrying, letting each step remind her that she still belonged to herself. The earlier pain was still there, but it no longer controlled her. It felt like the final echo of something she had already outgrown. She thought of Dr. Soro Makeni, of his belief in her, of the way he once said she would rise in places where people least expected it. And tonight she had, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a quiet one that felt even stronger. She lifted her head and let the city lights shine across her face. She didn't need their approval or their chair at their perfect table. She would build her own, and she knew now it would be made of the kind of strength no one could take from her.